Hi, this is Rob Carolina. I'm a lawyer and senior visiting fellow with the Information Security Group at Royal Holloway, University of London. And the purpose of this video is to talk for just a couple of minutes about the problem of acting reasonably in cybersecurity. What does a reasonable person do in cybersecurity? And the subtitle of this discussion is, When Did We Become Negligent? Because what this talk is really all about is discussing where negligence liability arises and how something can become negligent over time. So for those of you who haven't met me, I'm a lawyer and I am licensed in the US and England, and my specialism is in the law and regulation of information and communications technologies. My lecturing position with Royal Holloway is part-time, and I've been with them, lecturing with them part-time since 1999. In this talk, I first want to describe, for those of you who are not lawyers, what negligence liability is and what constitutes reasonable conduct. The core of the talk is going to be about how reasonableness can change over time. And in talking about how reasonableness changes over time, I'm going to draw some conclusions about what we can learn in the field of cybersecurity from this changing definition of reasonableness. First of all, let's just have a quick look at what negligence liability is. What does it mean to act reasonably? Roughly speaking, if we can make two statements, then we can see negligence liability. If we can show, for example, that Alice owes a duty of care to Bob, and we can show that Alice has failed to act reasonably in exercising her duty of care, then we say that Alice has breached her duty of care. We call Alice negligent. At its heart, that's what produces negligence liability. That's what can produce a lawsuit that causes you or your organization to lose money. If you owe a duty of care to another person, you fail to act reasonably, that opens you up to negligence liability. Now, of course, in this case, if Bob wants to sue Alice, he's going to have to prove that he has lost money or lost something as a result of Alice's negligence. People act negligently all the time. Sometimes they just get lucky and it doesn't cause any harm. But if Bob has been harmed by Alice's negligence, he can sue her and recover money. That means we need to focus pretty strongly on this question of what does it mean to act reasonably. The idea of what is reasonable conduct is really bound up very closely with expectations and standards of a given community. Now, this means that what constitutes reasonable conduct can change by geography, and it can evolve over time. To use a cybersecurity example, I've put a question here on slide 5. Is it reasonable for a company that offers an email service of type X within territory Y, is it reasonable for them to fail to implement cryptographic authentication on its POP3 server? There was a time when the answer to that was, well, that seems reasonable because not very many people do it. But today, as I record this in 2014, we see that most people offering email services will, in fact, enable cryptographic authentication, will make that possible. So, in assessing whether or not an act is reasonable, trying to figure out what would a reasonable person do, maybe the way to do that is to survey members of a given community. Or we could survey experts on what constitutes an acceptable practice or a best practice. Or, here's another way we can look at reasonable, and this is drawn from a very famous case in U.S. history called the T.J. Hooper. This was about an accident at sea that happened in 1928, and the facts are pretty simple. The T.J. Hooper was a tugboat that was hauling cargo barges up and down the Atlantic coast of the U.S. And this barge was at sea. It did not have a working radio receiver, and it was caught in a storm. And the evidence that came out in the trial that followed is that if they had had a working radio receiver, they would have heard a weather forecast, and the captain of the boat would have come in from the ocean, and the cargo would not have been lost. So it was pretty clear that if a radio had been on board, there would not have been this disaster and loss of money. So the question in the case turned on whether or not this failure to have a working radio was reasonable. Now remember, this was 1928. Radios weren't exactly new, but they weren't exactly common either. So as the judge, a famous judge by the name of Learned Hand, looked around the marketplace, what he found were a number of other tugboat companies who also failed to install radios. Now, because a lot of people in this industry, in fact perhaps the vast majority of people in this industry, did not have working radios, it kind of seems like the operator of the T.J. Hooper was acting reasonably. He seems to pass the reasonable person test. I mean, if he passes the reasonable person test, by definition, he's not negligent, which means he's not going to be liable for this loss. But was he really acting reasonably? And the judge in this case was famous for a number of reasons, but this is one of the reasons. He came to the conclusion, yes, I do believe this operator is liable. And in his decision, which came out in 1932, one great phrase from his decision is he says, common practice is not the same thing as reasonable practice. In other words, just because everybody else in your industry or in your specialist space is doing something a certain way doesn't necessarily make it reasonable. And he clarified this rule, or he clarified this principle many years later in a case called Carroll Towing. The same judge, faced with almost the same case, decided to express the same idea in a mathematical formula. And this is part of what made the case so radical at the time, is that judges in the early 20th century didn't really do mathematics, but this judge did. The mathematical expression that he wrote into his opinion was this, and these are the letters that he wrote as well. If B is less than P times L, then a failure to install the radio, a failure to implement a solution, is not reasonable. Since it's not reasonable, you're negligent. Because you're negligent, you're liable. And in this formula, B is the cost to implement a solution, P is the probability of loss without the solution, and L is the amount of loss that we can expect if disaster strikes because we failed to implement the solution. Now I've put in a couple of numbers here just to illustrate the principle. In Learned Hand's own decision, he didn't attempt to put in the specific costs of each of these steps. But he said on general principles he believed in this case there had been negligence. But if you see, just as an example here, assume that the cost of a radio receiver were as high as $75 in 1928. And I've assumed, for example, that the loss rate that you can expect without a radio, about 1 in 250 trips. You might have a catastrophic loss, and the amount of the loss is $100,000. Now once you do the calculation, you discover that $75, the cost of the solution, is certainly less than the cost of a disaster, the risk-weighted cost of a disaster. We have a 1 in 250 chance of a loss of $100,000, a 0.4% chance of a loss of $100,000, comes up to $400. You can see here that B is less than PL, making it absolutely clear that the failure to install a radio is negligence. Now, those of you who've done economics or business analysis will realize that this isn't particularly radical. All this is a cost-benefit analysis. What made it radical is that the judge was saying that conducting a cost-benefit analysis might actually be how we measure reasonable conduct, particularly when you're talking about a new technology or a new solution. The lessons of these two cases that were taught to me in law school many years ago is that an entire industry might be wrong. And using modern terminology from cybersecurity, best practice may not be good enough. Now I want to think some more about this principle. I want to illustrate this principle slightly differently. And to do that, I need to reorganize Learned Hand's famous formula in this way. In his judgment, he wrote, if B is less than P times L, then the party's negligent. I want to reorganize this as the following expression. If B minus the quantity P times L is less than 0, then the party in question is negligent. And these two formulas are algebraically equivalent. The reason I want to reorganize it this way is because I want to analyze a series of different technologies on a single scale, the B minus PL scale. So here the idea is that if we look at a particular solution, we can put it somewhere on this B minus PL scale, and it's a continuum. We find at the top of the continuum, if the answer to this analysis is a positive figure, then it is perfectly reasonable to reject the solution being analyzed. It's perfectly reasonable to reject the solution, and if you reject the solution, you are not negligent. Whereas, if the number that's produced in this analysis is negative, it is no longer reasonable. It is not reasonable to reject the solution, and rejecting the solution is negligent. If we think about a decision made by a tugboat operator, not in 1928, let's think about the year 1900 or 1895. We could think of a series of safety mechanisms or devices, and each of them labeled B. So on this chart, on this analysis, perhaps B1 would be something as simple and well known as an anchor and anchor chain. The cost of an anchor might not be small, that might be an expensive piece of equipment, but everyone understands how critical it is for the safety and survival of a seagoing vessel. Some other safety solution might be closer to the line in terms of cost-benefit analysis, whereas in 1900, it could be that a very advanced technology, it's still in the laboratory, it hasn't been proven, would come out very high on this scale, perfectly reasonable to reject it. Why do I say 1900 or 1895? Because I want to highlight that this was a decision made by tugboat operators at a first point in time. Let's call it time 1. There was a time when it would have been completely reasonable for a tugboat operator to say, we don't need to install a radio. First of all, radios would have been themselves, the cost of B would have been much higher. They would have been more expensive. And equally, having a radio might not have produced much benefit. There weren't any weather forecasts to listen to. Just having a radio, so the amount at stake, the probability of a loss in the absence of a radio probably would have been much lower. How many accidents would a radio avoid in 1895? Not very many. But things change over time, and that's really what I'm trying to focus on. There came a time, time 2, when the B minus PL calculation for each of these three solutions shifted on the scale. And if we think of B3 as the radio solution for a tugboat, we can see that it's moved a huge distance, in part because the cost of the radio has come down, but in part because the environment has changed. There are now regular weather forecasts that can be heard on radios, and you can avoid more accidents by having one. Similarly, there comes a later time, time 3, where we can see that the B minus PL calculation for each of these solutions has changed again. And at time T1, it was perfectly reasonable to reject solution B3. By the time we get to time T3, it's clearly negligent if you fail to adopt solution B3, and time 2 is roughly the time when we're crossing over from reasonable to unreasonable conduct. It's the time when you move from being reasonable to being negligent. Now, if we remove those other technologies from the picture and just focus on this line as a function of what happens to B minus PL over time, we see again that what this means is that a cost-benefit analysis conducted at time 1 can produce a radically different result when you reanalyze that same solution at time 2 and again at time 3. Or more importantly, and this is critical, what was once reasonable conduct, what once upon a time was a reasonable decision, can become unreasonable simply because time has passed. Time has passed, the environment has changed. There's no requirement for an organization to make a new bad decision. The original good decision could, over time, migrate into being something bad. Not because you decided to do the wrong thing, but because you failed to re-examine your original decision. So, as we see here, this is sort of the straight line figure of the reduction in B minus PL over time. Let's call this function x. And you can see on the timeline that I've now labeled these various times as time 3x and time t2x. Time t2x is the time I want to focus on because this is more or less where the decision to adopt this solution crosses the line from being reasonable to being negligent. The problem is that that might not be an accurate description of how cybersecurity environments change. I mean, let's consider, for example, that Moore's law is exerting continuous downward pressure on most technologically led solutions. Processing power is becoming less expensive, software is becoming more robust, more things are coming on the market, it's possible to do more things. So we have an ever-decreasing cost of any given type of solution if the solution is technology-based. So instead of a function like X, it may be that where cybersecurity defenses are concerned, the actual function looks more like this curve Y, an exponential function, because the cost of a solution might be dropping very rapidly, and it might be dropping as an exponential function. And you can see that time t2y comes earlier in time than time t2x. For a technology or for a solution like X, you have much longer period of time to re-examine your assumptions, whereas for a solution like solution Y, you're required to look at your decisions much more quickly. But that's not the whole story. There's more going on in the cybersecurity environment than just changes in the technology and more economically efficient ways of running computing power. We've also got, at the moment, a lot of migration into new infrastructures. And here I'm thinking of trends like the move to mobile, bring your own device, move towards cloud-based services. All of these, I believe, are exerting continuous upward pressure on P. Upward pressure increasing the probability of a cybersecurity disaster. Now, why is that? Basically because we're still learning how to secure these new environments. You know, we have many decades, we have like 4 decades of experience in terms of how to try to secure a single standalone computer. We have a couple of decades of experience figuring out how to secure local area network infrastructures and basic client-server architecture. Well, now we're moving into a radically different type of environment, and because it's new, because we still have mistakes to make, that is increasing the chances of disaster. Similarly, things like big data are causing us to aggregate larger and larger data sets. In other words, we're putting more and more eggs in a single basket. And if there's going to be a disaster, if someone is able to exfiltrate data or steal data from our organization, it's not a small set of data they're getting. Usually they're grabbing a very, very big set of data. So what we are losing is also going up. What we have at stake is also going up. And that, I believe, suggests that rather than function X or function Y, we're probably looking at an environment something more like this curve Z, curve Z. And as you can see, time 2Z is again much earlier, much closer to time t1 than either of the other two functions. Now, it's this reduction in time, this reduction in our window of re-examination that I really wanted to focus on. And this is one of the key points of the talk, is that the increasing speed of change in the cybersecurity environment, both the decreasing cost of certain types of solutions, increasing risk because of new infrastructure, aggregation of more data into larger data sets, means that the time we've got from when we make a first decision about a defense to a second decision is getting smaller. Some inconvenient truths: many migrations to new systems, towards the cloud, towards big data, many of them are designed to reduce costs from existing infrastructure. Adding security features and adding headcount, on the other hand, is swimming against the tide. It tends to increase the cost of these same systems. But many famous cybersecurity disasters come up not because of sort of single bad decisions about, how putting something at risk, but they come up in part because filtering or reducing a data set or installing a particular solution is more expensive than simply copying the whole thing. It's very often we see cases where people say, well, we could spend a lot of time segregating this data or finding different ways to secure it. Well, actually, in the age of big data with unstructured data sets, maybe what we should do is just run multiple copies of the whole thing because the costs of storage have become so small. And these are all changing and having an influence on the cybersecurity environment. Results here: If a cybersecurity environment remains unchanged, the risk of liability to your organization grows over time. If you make a decision and then leave everything as is without changing anything, the risk that you cross the line from acting reasonably to acting negligently grows over time. The rate at which that risk grows is probably exponential, in part because of things like Moore's Law. And furthermore, the rate at which that risk is growing is probably increasing. It's already exponential, but the rate of risk growth is probably increasing because of all of these radical changes to the computing environment that we're seeing in businesses today. This leads to, I believe, a strong business case for a continuous assessment of cybersecurity risks, a continuous assessment of cybersecurity solutions. It's not just about continuous assessment of threats, it's also about continuous examination of solutions. And most importantly, a continuous re-examination of cost-benefit decisions. Just because something was not cost-effective last year or last quarter doesn't mean that the same result would happen if we looked at that business case again today. And if you fail to look at that business case long enough, eventually you cross a line from acting reasonably to acting negligently, and that opens you up to potential liability under the law of negligence. I welcome your thoughts about these ideas, and I would welcome any correspondence or discussion of issues that arise as a result of anything that you've seen in this presentation. These are my contact details. Do feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much.